Chicagoland, and through celebrations in other parts of the state. One of our great presidents who very much changed the course of the direction of this country and this world for the better. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Thank you. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate today, a number of speeches recognizing the 100th birthday of the late President Ronald Reagan, which is February 6th. They've also been talking about the underlying legislation today, the FAA reauthorization bill, and coming up at 3 o'clock, Joe Manchin and his first speech, his maiden speech on the Senate floor. But the Politico reports today about some legislation that Senator Manchin is introducing. They say that he will use this speech today to trumpet legislation he's introducing that would prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from revoking Clean Water Act permits that have already been finalized. Those are his aides telling Politico today. Politico writes that Senator Manchin was livid in January when EPA pulled the plug on a massive mountaintop removal coal mine in West Virginia that the George W. Bush administration had signed off on in 2007. The move was the agency's first ever retroactive veto of a coal mine permit, and Manchin wants to make sure it's the last. That according to Politico. Look for that speech from Senator Manchin coming up this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, is the Senator in a quorum call?
Yes, Senator.
I would then ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, in 3 days' time across our country, from the North Country of New Hampshire to his final resting place in Simi Valley, California, Americans will celebrate the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. It will be the occasion of the 100th anniversary of his birth, and I'm really honored to rise today to join other colleagues of both parties and others throughout the United States and I'm sure the world in paying tribute to America's 40th president. I cannot speak as personally about President Reagan as some in this chamber can. I met him only a few times when, as a visiting state attorney general during the 80s, I was at the White House. He was always gracious, always responsive to us. But I did have one meeting that I might call a virtual meeting with President Reagan that reminds me of his enduring importance for our country today. 22 years ago, on January 4th, 1989, as President Reagan was departing the White House, having completed his second term, I had just arrived in Washington as a freshman senator from Connecticut. President Reagan was set to give his final weekly radio address on that brisk Saturday morning, and then Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell had honored me by asking me if I would give the Democratic response. It was a real honor, although a daunting one, for me to be asked to do that on that occasion. Looking back, I believe that President Reagan's 331st and final radio address on that January morning was among the most masterful and moving of his career. In it, he captured the very essence of the American spirit. He said, whether we seek it or not, whether we like it or not, we Americans are keepers of the miracles. We are asked to be guardians of a place to come to, a place to start again, a place to live in the dignity God meant for his children. May it ever be so, President Reagan concluded that morning. Needless to say, President Reagan's final radio address was, quite literally, a tough act to follow. In my remarks, I praised him for his love of country, for his fervent devotion to freedom, and for his commitment to the values of faith, flag, and family. I was, as I put it then, inspired and encouraged by his patriotism. And I urged all Americans to work on our unfinished business and the challenges ahead with the spirit of purpose and confidence that is the legacy of the Reagan years, end quote. Today, 22 years later, I continue to feel deeply honored that I was able to deliver those remarks and ever more confident of the importance of Ronald Reagan's legacy to us and the generations of Americans to come. The optimism, moral clarity, and confidence that President Reagan radiated inspired a generation, and they are precisely the ideals that we need today to rekindle and re-inspire the current generation of Americans and others, frankly, living without freedom around the world. I didn't always agree with President Reagan. That's a matter of public record. But I always understood the enduring value and strength and sincerity of his faith in America's values and America's destiny. In 1980, Ronald Reagan promised to make America great again, and he did. He expressed with total confidence that those who would challenge our hard-won freedoms would collapse, and they did. He led our country and the free world to victory in the Cold War against Soviet communism. And he never doubted for a moment that America and our cause could and would prevail. When in 1977, Ronald Reagan was asked about his vision for the end of the Cold War, remember he wasn't yet president, he responded with characteristic and refreshing directness. He said, and I quote, "My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simplistic. It is this: we win and they lose," end quote. But President Reagan's understanding of world affairs was far from simplistic. He was an optimist without illusions, who was guided by and frankly expressed moral judgments about what was right and what was wrong. We don't see that enough today. There's a kind of relativism afoot, but some things are just plain wrong and some things, thank God, are just plain right. President Reagan had the moral clarity to make distinctions between good and evil and the moral courage to speak the truth of those distinctions unambiguously and to support them unwaveringly. When he addressed an audience of veterans and world leaders commemorating the 40th anniversary of D-Day, standing as he spoke on the windswept coast of northern France, the very clifftop in Normandy, where courageous Allied soldiers fought to liberate Europe from the yoke of Nazi tyranny, President Reagan magnificently, masterfully, compellingly revealed again his moral clarity, and I'm honored to quote these words today on this floor. "The men of Normandy," Reagan said, "had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next. It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here, he said to the veterans, to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and those others did not doubt your cause. You were right not to doubt. You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for, because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. All of you loved liberty, President Reagan concluded. All of you were willing to fight tyranny, and you knew the people of your countries were behind you. End of quote. It's thrilling just to read those words again. Yet President Reagan never spoke about America's enemies belligerently. Rather, he spoke firmly and frankly about the deep divide between our morality and that of the Soviet Union. In doing so, I think he reawakened in all of us the belief that every human being has the potential to change history, because history, as Reagan knew, was made not by abstract, inexorable forces, but by real live men and women. It was President Ronald Reagan who came to the defense of the dissidents in their fight against the Soviet Union and reminded the world that a single courageous human face, a single courageous voice can tear down the faceless inhumanity of a massive repressive system such as the Soviet Union. Israeli leader and human rights activist Natan Sharansky once shared with me his memory of the moment when he first learned of President Reagan's 1982 speech before the British Parliament, the speech in which Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. There were some here in this country who thought that was much too stark and disrespectful. But Sharansky, who was a prisoner for nearly a decade in the Soviet Gulag, described to me how word of Reagan's speech spread through that heartless prison as he and his fellow dissidents tapped on walls and talked through pipes and even toilets to communicate the extraordinary news that the leader of the free world had spoken the truth, a truth, as Sharansky put it, and I quote, that burned inside the heart of each and every one of us, end quote. Indeed, President Reagan was willing to expose an inconvenient truth about the Soviet Union that unsettled and unnerved some of his contemporaries who feared his undiplomatic words were a threat to stability. And the truth is they were. President Reagan refused to accept the stability of an authoritarian status quo that consigned millions of people to live under perpetual tyranny. And so he did challenge the stability of the Berlin Wall and the Gulag and the Stasi, and in doing so, his moral courage helped inspire the men and women who brought down the Iron Curtain and expanded the frontiers of freedom. In his approach to foreign policy, President Ronald Reagan embodied that quintessentially American combination of idealism and pragmatism. He understood what America was about, which is freedom and opportunity, and he fought to extend those great values here at home and throughout the world. In his final words to the nation as our president, in a radio address on that January morning 22 years ago, President Reagan shared a story about a meeting Winston Churchill had with a group of American journalists in 1952. It was a time when many doubted whether the president could meet the challenges of the Cold War and whether the West could meet the challenges of the Cold War and prevail. Churchill asked the reporters, what other nation in history, when it became supremely powerful, has had no thought of territorial aggrandizement, no ambition but to use its resources for the good of the world? I marvel, Churchill said, at America's altruism, her sublime disinterestedness. End of quote. Churchill's friend and physician, Lord Moran, described the Prime Minister's demeanor as he spoke. All at once I realized Lord Moran wrote, Winston was in tears. His eyes were red. His voice faltered. He was deeply moved, end of quote. I think President Reagan was drawn to that story in his final radio address to the nation 22 years ago because he understood that in that moment Churchill understood and acknowledged the greatness of the American spirit. Imperfect though we are as human beings, it is the spirit that explains who we are and expresses all we aspire to be. He saw America's devotion to a cause that has defined us for over 2 centuries, a cause greater than our own individual self-interest or even national self-interest very often, and that has given us an enduring purpose to our national destiny, and that is the cause of human dignity and human freedom. At a time when we face many challenges both at home and abroad, and when it has unfortunately become fashionable to suggest that our best days as a nation are behind us, President Ronald Reagan's optimism and his abiding faith in America are more important to remember than ever before. They are as wise as they are true. Our shared national destiny, Mr. President, has always inspired us as Americans and propelled us forward together. It is the spirit that Ronald Reagan re-inspired in America at a time of great peril. And it is the spirit, I know, at this time of peril, here at home and around the world, that can carry us forward and continue to make us the greatest nation on earth and the last best hope of mankind. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the remarks of the Senator from Connecticut. I'm glad I had the opportunity to hear them. Mr. President, I, too, am here to celebrate Ronald Reagan's life, born 100 years ago, but also his nearly 50 years of influence on American public policy. And I would begin in this way. A few years ago, when he was President of the United States, President Reagan attended one of the many Washington press dinners that are held here. I think it was the Gridiron Dinner. It was well known that 90% of the people in the audience, the members of the press, had a different point of view on politics than he did. But they liked him anyway, and they respected him, just as he respected them. And I remember that evening that he strode into the Gridiron Dinner and smiling and looking like $1 million. The press rose and smiled back and applauded him. And President Reagan stood in front of the media until the applause subsided, and then he said this: "Thank you very much. I know how hard it is to clap with your fingers crossed." And the media laughed. They had a wonderful time with President Reagan. The first thing we think about, those of us who had a chance to know him, and that was a great many of, is that Ronald Reagan was a very friendly man. He was a congenial man, an easy person to know, the kind of person you would enjoy spending time with. He was very comfortable, as we say, in his own skin, and what you saw in private was what everybody else saw in public. But Ronald Reagan was about more than being friendly and congenial. And each of us has a personal story of his or her connection to President Reagan, and I have mine. And I'd like to use as an example this. 16 years ago this month, I stood, as a great many members of this body have, on the front porch of my hometown courthouse. In my case, it was Maryville, Tennessee. And I announced my candidacy for President of the United States. It was an offer that the people of the United States didn't accept. My preacher brother-in-law said I should consider that political defeat as a reverse calling, and I have, and I've gone on to other things. But as an example of the influence that President Reagan had on my generation and other generations, let me give you an example of what I said 16 years ago. 30 years ago, I said then, Ronald Reagan, before he was elected to any public office, made an address called Time for Choosing. He said that in America, freedom is our greatest value, and that then there were two great threats, communism abroad and big government at home. Looking back over those last 30 years, I was talking in 1995, I suppose we could say one down and one to go. Communism, the evil empire, has virtually disappeared. But big government at home has become an arrogant empire, obnoxious and increasingly irrelevant in a telecommunications age. In every neighborhood of America, the government in Washington is stepping on the promise of American life. The government in Washington, the new American Revolution is about lifting that yoke from the backs of American teachers, American farmers, businessmen and women, college presidents, and homeless shelter directors, and giving us the freedom to make decisions for ourselves. Ronald Reagan, I said in 1994, put it this way when he spoke in 1964. Quote, "This is the issue of the election, whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan ourselves." That was also the issue of the election in 1994. It will be the issue of 1996, I said, and for years to come. It took 30 years of unfashionable, principled leadership by the last Republican Washington outsider who became president to help collapse the evil empire. Now is a good time to give another Republican Washington outsider the opportunity to help put some humility in an arrogant empire in Washington, D.C. So you see that the issues of 1964, the issues of 1994, the issues of 2010, most likely the issues of 12 and 16 and beyond have a lot of similarity. And over that half-century, Ronald Reagan was the finest spokesman for that point of view, the finest and the most persuasive. Mr. President, we Americans say that anything is possible. And nothing symbolizes that more than the American presidency. We see it in President Obama today. We saw it in President Lincoln. We saw it in President Truman. We saw it in President Eisenhower. And we saw it in Ronald Reagan. No president symbolized that more in the last half-century than President Reagan did, though. He reminded us of what it means to be an American. He lifted our spirits. He made us proud. He strengthened our character, and he taught us a great many lessons. We celebrate the centennial of his birth and the half-century of his influence in public life. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to include at the end of my remarks Ronald Reagan's speech, A Time for Choosing, made October 27, 1964, which was the beginning, which launched him into public debate in the United States.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent following that to include remarks I made in Orange County, California on October 28, 1994, on the 30th anniversary of the speech, Time for Choosing.
Without objection.
And finally, Mr. President, I ask remarks to include in the record remarks that I made in tribute to President Reagan in June of 2004.
Without objection.
I thank the President. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I want to join with my colleagues. I appreciate what the Senator from Tennessee had to say about our former President Ronald Reagan as we look upon his 100th birthday coming up here this weekend, and all of us pay tribute to the legacy that he gave this country, the tremendous contributions that he made during his time in office. And we all have different, I think, remembrances and associations with his presidency. I was a sophomore in high school when he was elected to his first term as president back in 1980. I should say sophomore in college, and it was the first election that I had the opportunity to vote in. So I guess you could say I was sort of coming of age about the time he was coming on the national political stage. He, of course, had run for president 4 years earlier. But I remember just as a young person who was beginning to pay a little bit of attention to politics at the time, being so impressed with a number of the qualities, the attributes, I think, that characterized him personally and which were primarily responsible for the tremendous success that he had as a president and for the great legacy that he leaves behind. I was someone who grew up in a small town in South Dakota and had parents who, my father and mother had both come through the Great Depression, so they were very similar in terms of their remembrances of that period, and could really identify in many respects with some of the things that President Reagan talked about. But he was a person of strong convictions. He had a strength of conviction, I think, that was really appealing to a lot of Americans. He was someone who believed in American exceptionalism. He understood that the greatness of this country wasn't in its government institutions, but in its people and in its ideals. He was someone who was willing to confront the threats that we faced around the world, and the way that he took on the threat of communism and promoted freedom and democracy around the globe is something for which he will always be remembered, not only here at home, but by other countries around the world. And I think that he possessed in many respects a lot of the qualities that we value in the Midwest. He was a very humble person. I think his humility is something that really stood out. He was always referred to just Dutch Reagan, and his growing up, his formative years, and the impact that he had on this country, I think, was because he saw himself as just an ordinary American like every other American, and he was able to connect with and identify with the challenges and the opportunities that were facing Americans across this country at the time. I think he also possessed, although he was the governor of California, a Midwestern sensibility that never left. He had, in many respects, values that, as I said before, that many of us in the Midwest find really important. And his belief that you ought to live within your means, his sort of Midwestern bedrock values of individual responsibility were things that he always touched upon and themes that he referenced in his remarks. Those are the types of qualities, I think, that really differentiated him on the national stage. And I remember, too, as a young person being impressed with his sense of humor. And I think too often today, these are serious matters that we deal with, matters of great gravity and great weight, and they need to be taken with the right level of seriousness. But he also was able to see the best in people and to use his sense of humor to, I think, connect with people about what was really distinctive and what really unique about America. I remember the story that was told while we were fighting the Cold War about the guy in the Soviet Union who went in to buy a car. And he said, I want to buy a car. And the guy at the transportation department said, well, you can have your black sedan and you can pick it up 10 years from today. And the guy thought about it for a minute. He said, will that be in the morning or the afternoon? And the guy at the Transportation Bureau said, what difference does it make, 10 years from now? And the guy said, well, because I've got the plumber coming in the morning. And Ronald Reagan, I think, had a way of putting into very simple and understandable and sometimes humorous terms what was so distinctive and unique about the American experience. And that's something, I think, also that really set him apart. When it came to the big issues of the day, he had a statement that he made that I quote, and he said, there are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. And I think oftentimes we face these complex problems and we overanalyze a little bit, And the truth is, and a lot of the challenges that we face today, not unlike the times when he was president, there are not easy answers. But I believe there are simple answers, Mr. President. And I think those very basic core principles and those values that helped shape his presidency and the things that he never lost sight of are what made him an effective president. And I think that's a lesson that we can apply today. There are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. And when we believe in the greatness of America, and we look at the things that the foundation of this country, personal freedom, personal liberty, coupled with individual responsibility, he believed profoundly that you achieve peace through strength. He was willing to confront communism at a point in this nation's history when it posed a great threat to freedom-loving countries around the world. And I think that those are the types of qualities that for which President Reagan will be remembered. And as, again, someone who was very impressionable at that time, he was a great inspiration to public service. I think he represented the very best of public service, got into it for all the right reasons, understood the importance of what he was doing, the issues with which he was dealing, but always had an eye toward making a difference and providing a better future for the next generation. And that's a lesson, too, that I think all of us need to remember, that sometimes we have a tendency to believe that it's about us, it's about today, and I think we always have to keep an eye on tomorrow, on the future. And what are we doing to build a better and brighter and more prosperous and stronger future for future generations? And so when I think about and remember President Reagan as we come upon his 100th birthday, those are the types of things that strike me as really standing out, Mr. President. His humility, his sense of humor, his belief in American exceptionalism. Those are the types of things that I believe will characterize, that history will write, is already written about him, but will certainly permanently impress upon my mind, my experience, the time that I've had in public life, just the types of qualities that I want to apply and want to bring to the work that we do here in the United States Senate. So I rise along with many of my colleagues today and pay tribute to our 40th President and to his family. And, of course, we thank them for their great service and sacrifice, too, because anybody who's been in this arena knows the sacrifice that comes with public service. But we are indeed grateful for his great service to our country, for the way that he impacted so many, both here at home and around the world, and for the way that he continues through his legacy to impact generations of Americans today. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Missouri.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to speak for a few minutes today about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan inspired freedom and changed the world. Maybe nobody said that better than former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in a pre-recorded eulogy that was played at President Reagan's funeral at the National Cathedral. I'd like to read just a little of that eulogy. It starts, "We have lost a great president, a great American, and a great man." And Mrs. Thatcher said, "I have lost a dear friend." In his lifetime, Ronald Reagan was such a cheerful and invigorating presence that it was easy to forget what daunting historic task he set for himself. He sought to mend America's wounded spirit, to restore the strength of the free world, and to free the slaves of communism. These were causes hard to accomplish and heavy with risk. Mrs. Thatcher went on, "Yet they were pursued with almost a lightness of spirit. For Ronald Reagan also embodied another great cause, what Arnold Bennett once called, quoting Arnold Bennett, the great cause of cheering us all up." Back to Mrs. Thatcher. "His politics had a freshness and optimism that one covets from every class and every nation, or one converts, rather, from every class and every nation, and ultimately from the very heart of the evil empire. Yet his humor often had a purpose beyond humor. In the terrible hours after the attempt on his life, his easy jokes gave reassurance to an anxious world. They were evidence that in the aftermath of terror and in the midst of hysteria, one great heart at least remained sane and jocular. They were truly grace under pressure. And perhaps they signified grace of a different kind." Mrs. Thatcher says, "Ronnie himself certainly believed that he had been given back his life for a purpose. As he told a priest after his recovery, 'Whatever time I've got left now belongs to the big fella upstairs.'" And surely it's hard to deny that Ronald Reagan's life wasn't providential. When we look at what he achieved in the 8 years that followed, others prophesied the decline of the West. He inspired America and its allies with renewed faith in their mission of freedom. Others saw only limits of growth. He transformed a stagnant economy into an engine of opportunity. Others hoped at best for an uneasy cohabitation with the Soviet Union. He won the Cold War, not only without firing a shot, but also by inviting enemies out of their fortress and turning them into friends. Mrs. Thatcher goes on to say, "I cannot imagine how any diplomat or any dramatist could improve on his words to Mikhail Gorbachev at the Geneva summit." Quoting President Reagan, "Let me tell you why it is we distrust you." Mrs. Thatcher says, "Those words are candid and tough, and they can't have been easy to hear, but they were also a clear invitation to a new beginning and a new relationship that would be rooted in trust." Ronald Reagan's, now finishing with Mrs. Thatcher and moving to me for a moment, I'd say Ronald Reagan's truly only in America life story began 200 years ago this weekend. During his lifetime, he was a Democrat and later a Republican. He was a liberal and then a conservative. He was a labor union president and then president of the United States. During his lifetime, he developed a philosophy of faith, life, and government that Americans understood. Americans understood, and during his presidency, the people of this country had an extraordinary understanding of what their president would think and how their president would react to events and circumstances. Mr. President, the strength of the certain trumpet, the strength of the clarion call is, I believe, impossible to overestimate. Knowing how your president, how your leader views the world and views the circumstances that may meet us in the world is an incredibly comforting thing. In fact, there's an epic Greek fable more often applied to President Lincoln about the fox and the hedgehog. And in the epic Greek fable of the fox and the hedgehog, the fox is wily, the fox is clever, the fox knows lots of little things. But the hedgehog knows one really big thing. And in that fable and in reality, the fox can never defeat the hedgehog. Now, neither Lincoln, I'm really not comfortable referring to either Lincoln or Reagan and characterize them as a hedgehog, but I am comfortable characterizing them as men of big ideas, men who understood the big things, leaders who understood the big things. With Lincoln, it was the Union. With President Reagan, it was a focus on the big things with an understanding that you measured the circumstances and events that came up by your view of the big things that guide the country, that guide us individually, that guide lives, and in fact guide the lives of a nation. President Reagan understood big things. He could quickly evaluate any issue or challenge through that prism and the prism of those core values. Ronald Reagan, Mr. President, inspired freedom and changed the world, and the centennial celebration of his birth that begins this week and officially begins this weekend gives us an opportunity to think about what it was that made this president great, what it was that puts this president on the cover of news magazines in the decade before the centennial, and arm in arm in one recent cover with the current President of the United States. What was it that made this extraordinary man so extraordinary? And I would just say again, Ronald Reagan inspired freedom and changed the world. Mr. President, I question the quorum here.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senators coming to the floor talking about President Reagan on the centennial of his birth. Coming up in about a half hour from now at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin will deliver his first speech, his maiden speech on the Senate floor. Some other live coverage happening on the C-SPAN networks right now. The State Department is live on C-SPAN. The briefing focusing on political unrest in Egypt. Going back now to the Senate floor.
Mr. President, I have a statement to mark the service of former President Ronald Reagan, which I ask unanimous consent to place in the record at this time.
Without objection.
And what I want to say is, at the time of President Reagan's death, I put an extensive statement in the record, and as a California senator, certainly Ronald Reagan is one of our most famous residents, and was governor and then president. And I was in the House of Representatives while he was president, and clearly there were a lot of things that were disagreements between President Reagan and many of those in Congress, like myself, who didn't believe that government was the problem, which was his definite belief at that time. We certainly had a loyal opposition, and we certainly worked together when we could. But one of the things that was so interesting to me, compared to working with other presidents, because I've had the honor of serving for so long that actually President Obama is the 5th president I've had the honor of serving with. I went to every State of the Union address, all of which were really very impressive. I think the thing about Ronald Reagan that I grew to admire was, as hard as you might debate with him on his vision of what should the priorities be, what should we invest in, what was important, when those debates were over and a decision was made, regardless of who won the day, you just moved on to the next issue. And you tried to find the common ground. If you didn't, you had the respectful debate. It never was taken personally. And again, you know, there were many things I disagreed with him. I remember being a young member of Congress at the time when the AIDS epidemic came out, and I remember I was so frustrated because President Reagan was very compassionate, but he didn't really want to discuss the issue of AIDS, and we had to work very hard with Surgeon General at the time. We finally made a little bit of progress. So yes, there were many tough debates. And of course, his presence, his very sunny presence, his optimism about the country and the future was very important to a nation that had been torn asunder because of many tough issues that, you know, separated the generation. So again, I have a longer statement that I have already placed into the record, but I wanted to add my voice on this day when we remember former President Ronald Reagan, someone that California is very proud of, and someone who has obviously gone down in history for the many things he accomplished, particularly his rapprochement with the Soviet Union at that time. It was a big contribution to the world. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Here on C-SPAN 2, we're waiting for a senator to speak to hear more about President Reagan on the centennial of his birth. The Associated Press writing today that most Americans know Ronald Reagan as the president from California who swept a conservative revolution into Washington when he was elected in 1980. But Reagan's first 21 years were spent in Illinois. He moved from town to town with his family following his father's jobs before settling in 1920 in Dixon, Illinois. So we're waiting for another senator to come to the floor to talk about the president. In addition to the State Department that's live right now on C-SPAN focusing on what's happening in Egypt, more about the country later with a forum on the implications of the uprising in Egypt hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Schieffer School of Journalism. That's live at 5:30 Eastern Time on C-SPAN.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, just over 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States. It's hard to believe that 3 decades have passed since he stood in front of this Capitol just yards away and announced to this nation and the world that America's moment had not passed. And it's hard to think that we have been without him now for over 6 years. I think of him and his wonderful, lovely wife, Nancy, quite often. I knew them both very well, and I know Nancy very well to this day. And she's a terrific human being, as was he. One of my first campaign trips to Ronald Reagan was with Nancy. And I can tell you there never was a stronger advocate for a presidential husband, or as a husband, period. As a man, he had the rare combination of good humor and a commitment to principle. As a leader of his party and as president, he reminded us of the need for constant recommitment to our constitutional ideals. And as a couple, Ron and Nancy were a pair for the ages. If there was any doubt, my colleagues have confirmed today in their tributes to President Reagan on the centennial of his birth that Ronald Reagan might have passed on, but he is most certainly not forgotten, not by a long shot. When Reagan was president, he inspired great reactions from both parties. I can attest, particularly with respect to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that not all of those reactions were positive. Yet today's bipartisan celebration of President Reagan's legacy shows that he has become as much a part of the American story as his greatest predecessors in office. Like other great men before him, Ronald Reagan seemed to embody the times during which he lived. The man himself, his personal story, in many ways personified America's 20th century. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in the Midwest and became a Westerner moving to California like so many other of his fellow Americans. The country that he grew up in looked very different from our own today. As Michael Barone recently reminded us in an article in the Claremont Review of Books, when America entered the Second World War, 1/4 of Americans still lived on farms, and half of those were either without electricity or only recently acquired electricity. America's population was at the same time both more diffuse and more concentrated than it is today. America's non-rural population was clustered in a few great cities. Again, as Barone explained, at the outbreak of the Second World War, 2% of all Americans lived in Brooklyn, New York. America in the 20th century became a less rural, less agricultural nation. Yet instead of concentrating in existing urban centers, new communities grew and suburbs expanded. That was the story of Ronald Reagan, who was born in tiny Tampico, Illinois, population 772 as of the 2000 census, and came to the world's attention in California, home of suburban life and the American highway. He became a Californian through and through. He loved his ranch, and he loved being on the back of a horse. The large landscapes of California and of the entire West suggest the boundless opportunity that is afforded those who work hard in this country. It was there that Ronald Reagan found his professional and political success. It was where he met Nancy and raised his family, and it is where he was finally laid to rest. But Ronald Reagan did not have it easy. As he put it, he did not grow up on the wrong side of the tracks. But he could hear the train. He lived through the Great Depression, and like countless Americans before and after him, with dogged determination and a good deal of pluck, he succeeded. At a time when college was a luxury, Ronald Reagan graduated from Eureka College. He went on to have a successful career in radio and as a sportscaster, but that was not enough. So he moved to Hollywood, where he became an actor. Of all the roles that Ronald Reagan would play, we eventually identified him most closely with the character of George Gipp in Newt Rockne, All-American. It should come as a little surprise that we would associate a good Irishman like Ronald Reagan with a movie about Notre Dame and the Fighting Irish. When George Gipp first appeared on the screen, Newt Rockne, the head coach of the Irish, was at his wit's end with his team. Seeing Gipp, who was not a member of the team, laying around, Rockne asked him if he could go in and run the ball against the varsity. Reagan's Gipp responded with an Irish twinkle in his eye, "How far?" Naturally, he ran down the field, scored a touchdown, and took his place in Notre Dame lore. For Ronald Reagan, like George Gipp, there is no challenge too big. It is a good thing that he thought that way, because he faced plenty of obstacles. With the outbreak of World War II, his promising acting career was put on hold. Yet he would go on to serve as president of the Screen Actors Guild, and later he worked in television as the host of General Electric Theater. It was that association with General Electric that would set Reagan on his path towards the presidency. Going on what he called the mashed potato circuit, he spoke across the country to the thousands of GE employees, giving what would later be called the speech. Giving these after-dinner remarks, Reagan honed his thoughts about freedom, the size of government, and the Soviet menace. In 1964, on the eve of the presidential election, he would deliver that speech to the nation. Senator Barry Goldwater went on to lose that election in an epic landslide. Today we know that conservatives might have lost that battle, but they would ultimately win the war. A week before the election, Ronald Reagan delivered a taped address, A Time for Choosing, on Goldwater's behalf. He spoke as a partisan for liberty, and he urged his fellow Americans to join him in that struggle. He concluded his remarks telling a national television audience, "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth." This speech resonated with the American people. It raised $8 million for Goldwater, an astronomical sum at the time. More importantly, it made Ronald Reagan a formidable presence on the political scene. And I knew Barry Goldwater. I knew him well. When I ran for the Senate, he was one of 2 people I came to visit here in Washington to just get some advice from. I admired him so much, and it was a privilege to serve with him. The other one was Chuck Grassley, who was then in the House, and I count him as one of my dearest friends on earth. Reagan and Grassley, 2 great people. Goldwater and Grassley, 2 great people. Against the odds and conventional wisdom, Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California in 1966. Now, to the mistake of the California establishment, they underestimated the actor from the Midwest, and he went on to beat his more liberal primary opponent and the popular incumbent governor. Underestimating Reagan was a mistake that the Washington establishment would make time and time again when he arrived here 14 years later. They never seemed to understand what was so obvious to President Reagan. For all of the superficial differences, Americans of his age were not so different than the generation that founded this nation, fought the Civil War, worked through the Great Depression, and struggled for civil rights. In the end, Americans of today are committed to the same principles of liberty and equality that animated the authors of our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. This shared commitment to our founding principles served him well, because he took office at the time of great uncertainty, a time not unlike our own. A combination of factors seemed to be putting the aspirations of Americans out of reach. To be blunt, America was at its heels. The prime interest rate was 15%. Inflation was 12.5%. And civilian unemployment was at 7%. When he ran in '76, Ronald Reagan, when he ran, I was the first person he ever pre-primary endorsed. At least that was what I was told. And I have cherished that memory for all these years. But at that time, government regulations and tax rates were smothering American innovation, and with it, the American dream. And abroad, the picture was just as grim. An imperialist Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and was supporting revolutionary movements across the globe. The American hostages had not yet been freed from Iran. Yet when Ronald Reagan left office 8 years later, he had left his mark. According to his biographer, Lou Cannon, when he came into office, there were 4,414 individual tax returns with an adjusted gross income of more than $1 million. By 1987, fueled by tax cuts, the breaking of inflation, and explosive economic growth, there were 34,944 such returns. When he entered the White House, only 1 in 6 Americans owned a microwave, and VCRs were a luxury for the wealthy. By the time he left office, these were common household goods. He helped to restore our understanding of a limited judiciary that respects the traditions of the American people and their elected representatives, and he restored faith in our men and women in uniform. Just before he left office, President Reagan reviewed the troops at Andrews Air Force Base one last time. During that visit, he said that serving as Commander-in-Chief was the most sacred, most important task of the presidency. Barely 5 years after America left South Vietnam, Reagan spoke at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention and reminded America that Vietnam had been a noble cause. The rush to blame America first in our conflict with totalitarian regimes and the days of holding our military men and women in low esteem came to an end with the Reagan presidency. And though his greatest achievement, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, would occur on his successor's watch, The writing was on the wall by the time Ronald Reagan left office, and his successor deserves credit as well. His recommitment to freedom during our twilight struggle with what was truly an evil empire quite literally saved the world and liberated millions and millions of people. It is no surprise that he will be honored in Prague, Budapest, and Krakow, the home of his great partner, Pope John Paul II, later this summer for his role in exposing the great lie that was the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan succeeded as president because he knew what he was about. In his farewell address from the Oval Office, he said, "I went into politics in part to put up my hand and say, stop. I was a citizen politician, and it seemed the right thing for a citizen to do." I think we have stopped a lot of what needed stopping, and I hope we have once again reminded the people that man is not free unless government is limited. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as the law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts. I could not agree more. And that Reagan revolution, the aspiration of citizens for greater freedom and greater futures for the generations that follow, continues. I'm proud to have been part of that revolution. President Reagan took a flyer on me when I first ran for the Senate, supporting me in my primary. I have tried to do him proud. I remember well the blistering hot day in the Rose Garden when he signed the Hatch-Waxman legislation into law back in 1984. In his signing statement, he joked that with this law, everyone wins, particularly our elderly Americans. Senior citizens require more medication than any other segment of our society. I speak with some authority on that. That's what he said. In my opinion, that law typified the commitments of President Reagan. Since its passage, it has saved the federal government and consumers hundreds of billions of dollars. Some say trillions now. And it essentially created the generic drug industry and incentives for the creation of the next generation of saving drugs. I worked with him when he was in office, and as I work today for the citizens of Utah, his principled example is always on my mind. We still have work to do. Reagan understood the danger of what is today called progressivism, what was then called liberalism. It knows no bounds. As he put it, no government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. Government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. In some respects, Ronald Reagan belonged to a different age. He was governor during the student protests of the 1960s. He entered the national political consciousness during a presidential campaign where the possibility of global nuclear conflict was an imminent threat. When he became president, he was only a few years removed from the widespread urban riots and the end of the Vietnam War. When he spoke at Point du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he spoke to the men who actually scaled those cliffs and liberated a continent. Today, most of those veterans have passed on. But ultimately, Reagan remains one of us. I think that his advisor, David Gergen, got it wrong when he mused that Reagan's legacy was how much he changed our minds. In my view, Ronald Reagan was a success because he understood that the American people did not need to change their minds. Americans in 1980 had the same beliefs and hopes that we have always had. Ronald Reagan's genius was in giving voice to those hopes. Ronald Reagan was a big man, made for a big screen and eventually the biggest stage, and he played his part well. To borrow from Hollywood, he knew that even as time goes by, the fundamental things apply before leaving office. President Reagan addressed the nation one last time. Speaking to the citizens of this shining city upon a hill, he told us, we did it. We weren't just marking time, we made a difference. We made the city stronger. We made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. Indeed. It has been said that Ronald Reagan had a love affair with the American people. He did. But it took two to tango. Ronald Reagan loved his country, but I think his country loved him even more. And that includes people on both sides of this floor at the time. Mr. President, I yield the floor.